Mark leaned back in his chair at the small cafe in downtown Chicago, watching his wife, Linda, sip her coffee with a quiet intensity. They had been married for 28 years, but at this moment, they felt more like business partners than soulmates. "You really think we should separate our finances now?" Linda asked, her voice steady but curious. Mark hesitated. It was a conversation they had danced around for months, ever since he retired from his corporate job, while Linda continued to run her successful consulting business. At 55, they were in the middle of what should have been their golden years together. Yet, money was driving a wedge between them. Linda had always been financially independent. Even when they first got married in their late 20s, she had her own bank account, her own investments, and a sharp mind for money. Mark, on the other hand, had been the traditionalist, believing in joint accounts, shared expenses, and a unified financial future. But things had changed. Mark's retirement meant a steady but limited income from his 401k and pension, while Linda's business brought in substantial earnings. Their lifestyle remained comfortable, but there was an unspoken tension every time a big expense came up. Travel plans, home renovations, or even simple things like buying gifts for their grown children. Linda didn't mind covering extra costs, but Mark hated the feeling of taking from her. It bruised his pride. Meanwhile, Linda resented the assumption that because she was still working, she should be responsible for more. One evening, after yet another disagreement about vacation plans, Mark suggesting a modest road trip, Linda dreaming of an Alaskan cruise. Linda had finally said it out loud. "Maybe we should just keep our finances separate." The words lingered in the air. Mark stared at her, unsure whether to feel relief or resentment. He had never thought of money as something that should be divided between them. They had been through so much together, raising kids, dealing with job losses, paying off mortgages. Why now? Mark had grown up watching his parents share everything. His father, a steel worker, and his mother, a homemaker, never argued about money because there was never much to argue about. Their generation saw financial unity as a cornerstone of marriage. But times were different. Mark and Linda had both been married before. They had children from previous marriages. They had assets, debts, and obligations that weren't necessarily shared. Keeping money together had once felt like a necessity, but now it felt complicated. There was another thing Mark hadn't admitted out loud. He sometimes felt like a burden. When he was working, contributing equally had never been an issue. But now, when they went out for dinner, Linda often picked up the check. She had even offered to cover his golf club membership, a gesture he found generous but also deeply embarrassing. Was he being stubborn? Or was he holding on to an outdated idea of what marriage and finances should look like? One afternoon, Mark met up with his longtime friend, Jim, a 65-year-old widower with a wisdom that came from both experience and heartbreak. Over a couple of beers at their local pub, Mark laid out his dilemma. Is it crazy to split things up after nearly 3 decades together? Jim chuckled. Not crazy, practical. My late wife and I did it. Best decision we ever made. Mark raised an eyebrow. Jim had been married for over 40 years. Seriously? Yep, Jim said, taking a sip of his drink. We had different spending habits, different priorities. Keeping separate accounts meant fewer fights and more respect. We shared the essentials, house expenses, groceries, and date nights. But when she wanted to buy something extravagant, she used her money. When I wanted to spend on my hobbies, I used mine. Mark let that sink in. He had always equated separate finances with separation in marriage. But maybe Jim was right. Maybe it wasn't about division, but about balance. That night, Mark sat down with Linda at their kitchen table. She had just come back from a business meeting, looking both exhausted and determined. "I talked to Jim today," he began. He and his wife kept separate accounts. Linda looked at him carefully. "And what do you think about that?" "I think," Mark took a deep breath, "I think it might actually help us." For the first time in weeks, Linda smiled. "I love you, Mark, but I don't want money to be what pulls us apart. I've worked hard for what I have, and I know you have too. It doesn't mean I don't want to share with you, but I also don't want you to feel like you're depending on me." Mark nodded slowly. "So how do we do this without making it feel like a divorce on paper?" Linda laughed. "Simple. We split the essentials, household bills, utilities, and vacations we agree on. We each keep our own personal accounts for whatever we want to spend on. No guilt, no fights." It sounded reasonable. And just like that, a weight lifted. Over the next few months, their financial arrangement transformed their marriage. Mark no longer felt uncomfortable about Linda's earnings, and Linda no longer felt burdened by unspoken expectations. They still went on vacations, sometimes splurging on a trip Linda wanted, other times keeping it simple as Mark preferred. They still enjoyed date nights, home renovations, and spoiling their grandkids. But now, there was a newfound sense of fairness. Money was no longer a battleground. Mark even noticed a change in himself. He felt less anxious about finances, less defensive. He began picking up small projects, consulting gigs that brought in extra income, just enough to make him feel like he was contributing again. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Mark reached for Linda's hand. "I think this was the best decision we ever made," he said. Linda squeezed his fingers. "Funny, I was just about to say the same thing. Because in the end, love wasn't about bank accounts. It was about understanding, respect, and knowing when to let go of the past to build a stronger future. For couples in their 50s and beyond, the question of whether to keep finances separate isn't just about money. It's about what works best for their relationship. Every marriage is different, shaped by years of shared experiences, personal values, and evolving priorities. Some couples find comfort in shared finances, while others, like Mark and Linda, discover that a little financial independence actually brings them closer. So, should middle-aged couples keep their finances separate? The answer isn't one size fits all, but if it means more peace, fewer arguments, and a stronger marriage, then maybe, just maybe, it's worth considering. What do you think? Would you and your spouse ever separate finances after years of marriage?